Great. Yeah, I think we can get started now. Well, welcome everyone to our third task force meeting. We're happy you could be here. Hopefully you got all the pre-work materials via the notifications in monday.com and the memo that the Energy Office put together with answers to a lot of your questions. Please, that's not the end of those questions. You can certainly ask us more questions throughout, and we can provide interpretations of the statute if you do have additional questions. So we intend to continually assist you in that way. Julia, do you want to take over?
Yeah, I'll kick us off. So yeah, and we will kind of go through just spending a brief moment going over those questions, but of course we can answer them offline. We can have more of a discussion, making sure that everyone just kind of understands the reasoning behind some of the decisions that were made about those. But I think I'd love us to just get started with a quick round of introductions. We've got a full agenda today, so we'll keep it brief. I think last time we went into details on our position in the task force and conflicts of interest. So we don't have to do that today. So if you could just share your name, your organization, and then the apologies, there's a little background noise here. Your name, your organization, and one piece of good news. So I'll kick us off. My name is Julia Newman with Lotus Engineering and Sustainability, and piece of good news is I walked to get lunch today from our office, and walking back, I was holding my lunch and my hands got really cold, and it was like not super pleasant, but also like very exciting that it felt like the beginning of the winter season coming on. So I'm ready for it. Diane, I'll pass it over to you, and then just to avoid any issues with background noise here, maybe you can kind of roll us around to other folks.
That sounds great. Thanks, Julia. Hi, everyone. I'm Diane Ernst. I'm a research associate at Lotus. One piece of good news. Well, I'm visiting my nephew right now, so it's always fun to see him. He's 6 months old, and he's just like a bundle of joy. So I get to spend my evenings with him while I stay down in Denver for the week. Bill, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks. Oh, which Bill?
Yeah, Bill.
Oops, great question. I'm going around my screen, so we'll go with Bill Green. We'll come back to you later, Bill Martin.
Okay, I'll go back to sleep.
Okay, Bill Green, mechanical engineer with the RMH Group, representing ACEC Colorado. And I think the good news is that I got my ski pass to Winter Park and gonna teach my granddaughter to ski.
Sounds like so much fun.
Yeah, if it snows.
Yeah, we'll keep our fingers crossed. John, you're next on my screen.
Sorry about that. John Lauer, I'm with Newmark. Good news. Looking forward to the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. So
great. Cecil?
Good afternoon, everybody. Cecil Courtney, business agent for Pipe Fitters Local 208. The good news is I have all the next week off, so I'm enjoying a little family time. So that'll be good. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Karen?
Hi, everyone. Karen Hancock, City of Aurora, and we are redoing our kitchen in pandemic fashion, and we now have a vaccinated contractor as of yesterday.
That's great. Jeff?
Yes, good afternoon. Jeff Guida, Iconergy. My good news is the Broncos have a bye, so I don't think there's any way that they can lose this week, but yeah.
I like the spin on positivity there. That's great. Stacy.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stacy Bumgarn. I work at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. And a piece of good news is of course, the university is always doing some aspect of strategic planning, and I'm on a strategic planning drafting group. And we just finished a big chunk of our work. And, it just, whether it goes anywhere, who knows, but breathing room is nice. Good to be here today.
Yeah, that's always great. Just in time for the holidays. Jenny?
Good afternoon, Jenny Gonzalez, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, electrician by trade, agent right now. Piece of good news, both of my children, 10 and 8, got their first vaccine shot. Super excited. So that's it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Maria.
Hi everyone, Maria Agazia with Iconergy, and my piece of good news is that I will be spending the weekend in the mountains. So excited to soak up the last bit of fall weather before it gets too frigid up there, and just enjoy the outdoors.
Great, and Zach?
Hi, everyone. I am not a full member of the task force. I'm a guest today, but Zach Hart, I'm with the Institute for Market Transformation. We're a nonprofit organization that works on energy efficiency and decarbonization policy in buildings. My piece of good news: on Saturday, I am taking my 18-month-old son to see his grandparents' house for the first time. So it's a 7-hour drive, so that's the bad news, but the good news is when we get there.
Great, yeah, we're very excited to have you present today. Thanks for being here. Tracy.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Tracy Phillips. I'm with Sustainable Real Estate Solutions and the Colorado CPACE program. And my son was just accepted to CSU early admission. So it's his first choice and he's very excited. So we're excited for him. So that's it.
They're from a CSU alumni. That's exciting. Nori.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nari Boyd. I'm the director for the Boulder County Housing Authority. And my good news is I too just got my 3rd vaccine and was brave enough to go to the movie theaters with my family and eat like a tub of buttered popcorn and Coke, and it was heavenly. Thanks.
That sounds perfect. Eric.
Hi, Eric Jeanette with Iconergy. And Kim, I think we just sent you a message. We're looking to get Mark Stetz invited too. Energy engineering, and my piece of good news is I was successful in installing an auxiliary battery in my Westphalia van again last weekend. So I've been wanting to do that for a while. And it works.
Great, and thanks for letting us know about Mark. We are working on it. Thank you. Yeah. Katrina.
Hi, everyone. Katrina Manigan with the City and County of Denver. And my good news is my dad comes to town tomorrow, and I haven't seen him since the pandemic started. So I'm pretty excited.
Oh, that's great. Crystal?
Hi, everyone. Crystal Agelkamp with the Colorado Energy Office. My piece of good news is that I went to a comedy show last night for the first time in 2 years. I guess going to any show. Everyone was vaccinated, so that's why I felt comfortable, but it's nice to get outside and actually like laugh. So
it's those little things. I love it. Joel.
Good afternoon, Joel Danforth, Energy Programs and New Business Director for United Power. My piece of good news is that as of a couple of weeks ago, we have gone through our data exercise to take the list of covered buildings from the state, 8,000 strong, and winnow that down to the 300-ish that are served by United Power so that we can map that to meters and provide those building owners with their data. So step 1 complete. Happy to report that.
Great news. Kirk.
Good afternoon, everyone. Kirk Longstein with Fort Collins Utilities. Piece of good news today. I just got my booster shot, so really excited, but I'm also antsy for what the side effects will be.
Yeah, I've heard mixed reviews, so I'll keep my fingers crossed for you. Christine.
Hi, Christine Brinker with Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, and I have two, a professional and a personal one. Professional, the Energize Denver BPS recommendations passed the City Council committee hearing unanimously, and now they're headed to the full City Council to be voted on the 22nd. And my personal piece of good news, I just had a smoothie that had chocolate in it, and it is such a good day for some chocolate.
Popcorn, chocolate, it's great. Will.
Will Tor, the director of the Energy Office. And my piece of good news is that yesterday evening I got our latest numbers on electric vehicle market share in new vehicle sales in Colorado. And we're now getting close to 10%, which we were at 2.5% when I began this job. And our 2030 projections were 6%. So some pretty darn good news there.
That's great news. All right, wake up, Bill, you're up.
Sorry to take me off mute. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm with Centura Health, Vice President, Real Estate and Construction. And I'm happy that my 4 adult children will be coming home next week. So I get to spend the holidays with them. So I'm looking forward to it, taking some time off. Thank you.
Great. Paul?
Hi, Paul Hutton with Cunningham, but representing the American Institute of Architects. Well, I got to spend most of last week hiking in an amazing place, Joshua Tree National Park. Highly recommend it if you haven't been able to spend any time down there.
Great. Jim?
Thanks. Jim Hartman, a building redeveloper, a solar guy with Hartman Ely Investments. Our good news is not quite now, but in a few weeks, we're going to bring our next all electric building online. And then I get a break for a little while.
Oh, Diane, you're muted, but I'm guessing you're going for Sean next.
Correct. You read my mind. I was going to say, Sean, I know you'll speak later, but if you want to introduce yourself now, that'd be great.
Sure. My name is Sean Denniston with New Buildings Institute. My good news is we are finally closing on a house in Philadelphia that we have had to hold on since the real estate crash, and now we're selling it during a pandemic. I think we have bad timing, but we are finally about to be done with it, and very, very happy.
Fun. Yeah, like seeing the end of the road there is great. Kara.
Hi, Kara Carmichael with RMI. I think my good news is that I'm really excited by federal leadership in buildings and kind of what's coming up, particularly around building performance standards. So stay tuned.
Thanks, Kara. Mark.
It worked. Hey, Mark Stitz here with Iconergy. Be, I guess, filling in for Jeff Gaida. So I'll be kind of the data geek looking at some of the information here. And my good news is that we just moved back to Durango, Colorado.
Fun, beautiful spot.
Mm-hmm.
Kathy.
Hi, Kathy Barsner with NAIOP Colorado. And my good news is I got to spend the weekend with my son's fiance, and we got to go wedding dress shopping, and she said yes to the dress.
That's an exciting momentum in that process. Fun. All right, and Michael. Michael, you might be muted. All right, maybe we'll come back to that. All right, great. I think that's everybody. I didn't miss anybody. Perfect. All right, well, I'll pass it over to you, Julia.
All right, thanks so much. Again, great to have you all here today. So we are in our third task force meeting here today, which is very exciting. We're just cruising right along. We've already gone through introductions. We will have, of course, these PowerPoint slides up on Monday.com after we finish the meeting. So if you ever forget who's in this group with you, this list will be linked there as well. Just want to ground set again and remind everyone kind of our overview of our goals and our outcomes of this work, and really what what we're trying to do is reduce emissions sector-wide 7% by 2026 and 20% by 2030. In doing so, we're hoping to develop building performance standards that are equitable, low carbon, and advanced clean energy. And then we're also, of course, hoping to reduce GHG pollution, lower energy costs, and improve air quality. Our meeting norms, I don't think I need to spend much time on this, but mostly just be present, be respectful, and know that this is a space where you are always welcome to share your thoughts and comments and expertise. That's why you've been asked to be a part of this group. So thank you for that. For today, we will be going through first and foremost our guiding goal statements. We'll spend about 10 minutes chatting about that, and then we're going to hand it over to Sean and Zach to share with us, just some of more broadly what's happening in terms of BPS across the country, what other communities have been implementing, and then digging in a little bit to the metrics. If we need to after that, then we'll jump back to those guiding goal statements just quickly so we can wrap up that conversation. But then we will take a break at 2:10. So we'll have 5 minutes to get up and stretch. We'll come back, and if there are any other discussions on BPS metrics or questions we need to answer, then we'll go through that. And then following that, we'll kind of dig in much more deeply into the pros and cons of different approaches to using metrics and different broadly BPS approaches that are used elsewhere, trying to get a sense of what resonates with you all for Colorado, and what is maybe applicable to think about utilizing for our BPS, and then what maybe doesn't fit as well for our state and context. If we have time, we would love to chat a little bit about the public engagement process, but we also don't want to cut short the conversation on metrics and approaches. So we'll see if we get to that today. And then we'll just do a quick recap in closing before we move on to our days and our Thanksgiving holidays coming up. Perfect. Any questions before I move on? Any questions on the objectives or the agenda for today? No, all right, that's great. So if you remember back to our last meeting, we developed guiding goal statements in these 6 areas of equity, cost, workforce, reliability, an engaged and informed community, and a streamlined process. So really, we developed somewhere between, I think, 4 and 6 goal statements within each of these areas. What we're going to be doing now is going through a process of determining whether or not those are the right goal statements for us to use sort of in tandem with emissions reductions as we're thinking about what we want a BPS for Colorado to achieve. So as we go through this process, we mentioned, I think at the first meeting, that we'd be using something called a fist to 5 approach for voting. So what that means is basically I will be showing on the next coming slides each of those different groups of goal statements and the list of what we've developed in them. And then we would love for everyone to just, if you are able to keep your camera on for this part, that would be very helpful. If you can't get your camera to work, or if you're having trouble with that, then if you could just put in the chat a number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or 0, I guess is also a number that you can select. But basically, we are looking to understand to what level you support using these guiding goal statements for the work that we do moving forward. So a fist, a 0 means no way, a 1 means I need to talk about this. A 2 means I could potentially be convinced, but I think I need some convincing. A 3 means pretty much I'm okay with this. And then a 4 is a little bit more enthusiastic, okay. And a 5 is love it. These are what we should be using. So Diane will be kind of taking a look at your pictures there. And so as we go through these, then we'll ask you to just like hold that up for a minute so she has time to count all of your responses here.
And it would actually be really helpful is if you're not a voting task force member, if you could turn your camera off, then it'll just be quicker for me to be able to count. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point. Perfect. So our 4 equity guiding goal statements are BPS that provide pathways to reach targets that include options and not a one-size-fits-all approach, to reduce energy burden and enhance the co-benefits accrued to all parties through BPS. And by co-benefits, we mean things like improved health and safety, improved indoor air quality, et cetera. To ensure benefits that are distributed to both residential and commercial owners of covered buildings, regardless of the building size. And then to ensure that all building owner types benefit from reduced energy burden. So if you could quickly just show us what you think of those and what your level of support is. And while you're throwing those up there, and just keep them up as Diane counts, I will note as well, I forgot to mention it, we are looking for a 2/3 majority. That's how we've defined consensus. And that was, again, something that we discussed at our first meeting. So, as long as we have 2/3 of you all agreeing with a 3 or above, then that is what kind of confirms this as a guiding goal statement.
I have a question on these.
Absolutely.
The second and the fourth both seem to be about energy burden, though the second is also about co-benefits. I wondered if those could be consolidated. The second one seems to already encompass the fourth one.
Yeah, I would say so. Is anyone opposed to consolidating those? All right, hearing none.
I was curious, Julia, too.
Yeah,
is there
please.
a section that discusses the split incentive issues that we talked about before? Does that come up in another goal statement?
I'm trying to
I have
remember
the
if there's,
third one.
yeah,
The co-benefits? Okay.
No, make sure the benefits are distributed to both residential and commercial.
That's just owners, not tenants.
we could include owners and tenants in there if that would.
Right.
If that's okay with everyone.
Mhm.
Any opposition to that? Okay, looks like, Jim, did you have a question?
Just a comment, since this will all ultimately be read by lay people, I think we might want to even be sort of pedantic and explain in parentheses what we mean by reduce energy burden.
Sure.
So it's clear to the average person.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so with those changes, we have adding tenants to the third bullet point, combining the fourth bullet point and the second bullet point, since they both reference energy burden, and then providing a definition of energy burden so people understand what is being referenced there. With those changes, does anyone need to change their vote? All good? Okay. Diane, are we at a 2/3 consensus for that one?
We sure are. Thank you.
All right, great. So our next, Michael, glad to have you join us now. Thanks to, sorry about those technology issues. It always happens. Our next set of guiding goals is in the workforce realm. And these are 4 goals of working with local education entities and infrastructure and employers to develop and facilitate training programs, ensuring training is available for both installers and building operators and technicians, conducting education and outreach programs to ensure the existing and new workforce is aware of upcoming changes, and then ensuring minority-owned business and workforce members are supported through the transition and provide education and training in multiple languages. And we did have a suggestion from Kara in Monday.com to add women to this last one. So it says ensure minority and women-owned businesses.
And could I just say, I'm not okay with the word minority or women or I mean, like calling out, because there's a lot of spectrum there. And so I was hoping maybe this group could brainstorm on a different word that we could use. In Aurora, that's the majority of our population is minority in this context. So it's just not a good word. So maybe there's somebody who could help with that.
I think that's a great point. Do we have any suggestions on? Mark has suggested everyone, ensure everyone, or maybe all business all businesses and workforce members are supported. So that's one suggestion. We could also look at saying underserved or underrepresented could also be, if we want to specifically target, noting that we're highlighting the needs of underserved or underrepresented business owners.
And maybe
Is the intent?
yeah, to say who that is. Who were you thinking of when you said minority? That would help me.
Well,
Is this people of color or BIPOC communities? Or
yeah, I think this comes because this came out of your comments in the second meeting. So I would actually turn that question back around on you all. I would tend to think that yes, we are thinking BIPOC and maybe even LGBTQ, folks of color, definitely women, would all fall under that kind of minority category. So
are these businesses that are disproportionately impacted?
I would often, yes, I do think so. That's a good point.
Or traditionally disadvantaged.
Is there any one of those terms, traditionally disadvantaged, disproportionately impacted, underserved, underrepresented? Are there any specific terms that folks feel would be most appropriate here? Any strong feelings one way or another?
Underserved.
And I still like the word all, although underserved or traditionally disadvantaged would be fine. I think just the all, even if it was underlined or something.
Yeah. What if we changed it to ensure all business and workforce members, particularly those who have been underserved, are supported through the transition and provide education and training in multiple languages? Does that work? All right. I think we have a
I'd like to
resolution.
ask a different question if I could, Julia.
Yeah,
Is
please.
workforce as a term meant to include the design and consulting communities, or would they show up in a different location?
That's a great question. Generally, I would say the way I think about workforce is more so in the construction and trades industries. But I think if we want to expand it, we can. But I think more traditionally, that's what it's used to define. I see Jenny kind of.
That would be typical for me too. I'm just wondering if anywhere in these goals we're going to look at, we are going to mention the needed outreach to design and consulting.
Yeah, we do have that under, I think, engaged and informed.
Okay,
community.
good. So that'll show up. Okay,
Yeah,
fine.
absolutely.
Then I'm good with this.
Okay. Quick fist of 5 on these 4 then with those changes. And Nori, go ahead, please.
I still kind of like Jenny's suggestion in the chat of all of it, like underserved, people of color, low income. Is that too much?
I guess I got confused on which phrase we're voting on.
Let's put it here. Let me put it in the chat here. And Kate, go ahead while you're.
I was just going to ask a question about that, the last one that we were talking about, the way it's written, the ensure minority owned businesses and workforce members are supported. And just what do we mean by supported? Is that mainly the providing education and training in multiple languages, or are there other elements that we are inferring by support, if that makes sense? Because if it is mainly about education and training in multiple languages, then we talk about that, or then that I would think would be what we would want to lead with in terms of supporting workforce, and then to include that they would be in, to support, then listing all the different groups, So I guess that would be my thing is are we saying enough by just saying support, or do we mean more by support than providing education and training in multiple languages?
Good question.
I might weigh in here and try to, if it's okay, and just try to give some current experience that AGC has in this very area because we provide support to emerging, which is a newer small business, and minority certified businesses, which is an existing government certification that could be from the federal government or local government. And then we also provide support, training and support to individual humans that would go through a workforce training program. And we have specific goals to add more companies that come from some of these populations. So the owner of the company, and then we also try to recruit from these populations in greater percentage for workforce recruitment into the construction industry. And so an example for a company would be that we might have training programs for companies on how to incorporate a new process. And this could be a new process. Well, the larger companies can afford to pay a registration fee, which funds the people and the infrastructure that provides that training. But an emergency or a historically underserved business owner might need a free tuition to that course. So that's an example. And then once we train workforce members, the same type of thing. Some people might be able to fund through tuition training to enter a very attractive career path, but other underserved populations might need tuition so that they have a low cost or a no cost way to get there. And then the company to come on the time to hire those trained individuals, most of the companies can afford to pay for part of the cost of that. But again, those companies might need a free tuition to come to that hiring fair. So that just kind of describes what some of the kind of current things that we're doing. And even though it's one continuum, we kind of see the company owner and the employees being trained and recruited in two different buckets because they're served in different ways. But a lot of times it's in the subsidizing of whatever the cost is to do those things.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Michael. And Kirk, I see that you threw in the chat, equitable access to education and training resources is maybe what we mean by support. I think what I'm going to do at this point is just hit a pause on this conversation because I do want to be respectful. We've got a couple of guest speakers and I know they're on a timetable as well. So let's just keep this in the back of our minds. We'll return to this after we hear from their presentations. But I will hand it over to you all, Zach and Sean. And I believe, Kim, if you haven't yet, then maybe give them some control so that they can screen share.
Okay, can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Looks good. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for having Sean and I on today to present. So what we're going to do is at the first part of the presentation, run through existing building performance standard policy models. So really focus on the structure of the different policies out there. And then Sean is going to present on the different metrics that are either jurisdictions are using or you could use. There's not time to really dive deep on these policies. So on each policy, so what we did is grouped them basically into kind of 3 categories. So what I'll do is go through kind of one example from each category and maybe highlight interesting differences within a category where appropriate. So without further ado, so the first category we wanted to talk about are policies that are structured around recalculating the standard on a consistent basis, usually a 4 to 5 year basis. There's actually 4 policies here. I didn't have time to add Chula Vista, California to this, but they use a very similar structure. DC was the first jurisdiction to adopt BPS, and they used this structure. We had St. Louis follow suit and Washington State follow suit pretty closely on their heels and use this recalculation method. I'll get into what that means in a second, but you can see the coverage of commercial multifamily buildings, the size on these, the metric that they use. DC uses the Energy Star score as its primary metric. They use actually source EUI for score ineligible buildings. So not every building can get an Energy Star score. Sean will talk more about that. For those, DC uses source EUI, which is part of the Energy Star Portfolio Manager benchmarking program. It's an automatic output. And they have a number of different compliance paths buildings can use to comply. We see something similar in St. Louis. They use site EUI rather than Energy Star score, and they only have one kind of customized compliance path. In Washington State, a little more like St. Louis, site EUI, custom compliance path based on life cycle cost analysis. So I'll look a little more closely at DC's law. So DC is going to, they define the performance standard based on the Energy Star score for each building type. It has to be at least the median for the type, but it can go beyond that. If you, like I said, you can use source EUI for buildings that cannot earn an Energy Star score. That standard is recalculated for every new compliance cycle, which happens on a 5-year basis. And because they're going down to 10,000 square feet, which is quite an aggressive standard, that's a lot of buildings to manage, they're phasing it in over a 12-year time period. So we're now starting on the 50,000 square foot and up phase. Real quick, the way that they do the recalculations, there's the first compliance period is 5 years. Then there's a year in the middle where the government kind of looks at, they evaluate the progress of all the buildings covered under the policy, and they issue a new standard for the upcoming 5-year compliance period. So from a building owner's perspective, this little graphic shows kind of what compliance looks like. They benchmark their building. The Department of Energy and Environment establishes the standards, and you basically evaluate against that standards. If you meet it, you know, you're good. You meet the standard. You have no regulatory requirements for BEPS period 1. So this happens at the beginning of the compliance period. So if in your 2021 data shows that you are compliant, you're good until the next compliance cycle. However, if you don't meet the standard, then you enter a compliance cycle, and there's a number of different compliance paths that Washington, DC offers. They have a performance path where buildings that don't meet the standard have until the end of the compliance cycle to reduce their site energy use intensity by 20%. So the standard is based on an Energy Star score for most buildings. But the performance path, you actually look at your site energy use intensity. I hope people are familiar with the metrics to some degree. We will go into them, what these mean a little bit more. I saw some of the materials you've been that you kind of give some basic definitions of these. In addition to the performance path, they also offer a prescriptive path where they give you energy measures that you can install. Essentially, the process is you have to have an energy audit. You have to implement measures recommended by, from a suite of measures recommended by your energy auditor that will become, in compliance or are calculated to be equivalent to roughly the performance path. And then there's an alternative path where under certain circumstances, building owners can propose an alternative, more customized path. That is to allow building owners to take advantage of certain life cycle events in the building's lifetime. So that could be, large equipment replacement. That's a good time to make a lot of improvements in your building. You can take this alternative path to time your compliance around those sort of major building life cycle events. I think the thing to point out about DC is, having heard feedback from the folks implementing this and feedback from building owners that are preparing to comply with this, it's quite a complex policy. I mean, you're not going to get away from some degree of complexity with building performance standards for sure, but this one is goes from complex to arguably overcomplicated. I think people are having a really hard time understanding the variety of compliance paths, the different metrics that are in use. And this is not something that anyone working for DC is unfamiliar with, they're hearing these concerns from building owners pretty frequently. And I think that's just part of being the trailblazer. But definitely complexity is a concern here on the implementation side of managing the program, and also on the compliance side of if you're a building owner trying to meet these requirements. The other thing to mention about the recalculated standard type generally is that it's not conducive to long-term planning, right? So building owners would like to know where they need to perform down the road into the future so that they can factor that into their long-term property management plans. Like what, let's factor that into how we're going to manage upgrading equipment, things that are on a longer term time frame than 5 years. And they don't have that certainty with the recalculation method. Every 5 years, they're going to get a new target they have to aim for. And that can be quite limiting for their planning purposes. So St. Louis, very much like DC, except they've simplified the compliance paths to just to one compliance path. Well, you can meet the standard, or if not, you have the option to submit an alternative compliance path, which is customized. And again, that is to take advantage of the major equipment replacements, or if you have financial hardship or some reason that you can't meet the standards on, as prescribed on the kind of standard timeline, you have the chance to make the case that you should have a custom set of requirements. State of Washington is structured similarly. They do base their policy on the ASHRAE Standard 100 2018 with some state amendments that kind of spell out how this works as ASHRAE 100 works as a policy, but they use site EUI targets for buildings. Standard is to be updated every 5 years per the law. I think this is a graphic of the compliance path. Because we're based on standard 100, we can see that there are requirements for energy management, operations, and maintenance built into this policy, as well as the site EUI targets. They also offer this investment criteria compliance path, which is similar to the alternative compliance paths I mentioned with St. Louis and DC, where you can basically is meant to be more conducive to longer term planning. I know I'm going quickly through here. These slides will be made available to you, and I'm also available to kind of hang around a little longer through the discussion, answer more questions. So the second type of policy structurally is the long-term greenhouse gas-based standards. We've got 2 examples of this, New York City and most recently Boston, which adopted their law in September of this year. Both covering commercial and multifamily buildings, going down to roughly the same size of a building. Their metrics is annual greenhouse gas emissions, and then they set targets going out far into the future, and then every 5 years those emissions limits get stricter, right? So over time you're continuing to ratchet down. They also offer alternative compliance methods. Similar to what I just described. So trying to help building owners that have structural issues or financial issues, or maybe timing issues around equipment replacement. They can put in for these alternative compliance plans to have a little more flexibility. So we'll look at New York City. So a few things to mention. We're looking at greenhouse gas intensity, so GHGs per square foot, essentially. There's some concern, there's definitely some concern from building owners that there's no way to normalize greenhouse gas per square foot based on the operational characteristics of a building. So density is one way to think about this. If you have a lot of workers or long hours, so you're using the building, pretty significantly or harder, so to speak, than other buildings, there's no credit for that. So you may be using more energy because you're a more densely occupied building, right? Or you have more computers per square foot than another building that maybe has the same use type, you know. So there's some concern around the fairness of the metric in that respect. And that's something that's Sean will talk about regarding all the metrics later on. Let's see. The buildings have to meet the standards annually. So starting in 2024, you have to every year stay under the limits. As I said, they get more stringent over time. One thing to note also is the kilowatt hour to greenhouse gas conversion factor for electricity has been set out to 2029. So that gives a certain degree of certainty to building owners. However, beyond that is still to be determined, right? So looking beyond there, this policy goes out to 2050. Building owners don't know where they don't know what's going to happen to the grid. How clean will it be? That's out of their control, and it makes them, we're hearing that it's making them kind of concerned that this is out of our control. We're being held responsible for it. How do we plan for this? We don't know which way the grid's going to go. Again, an issue I think Sean will talk about more. Let's see, they do, as far as compliance goes, obviously making energy improvements to the building will reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, but they also allow renewable energy credits to be purchased and some limited offsets to compensate for going over the emissions limits. The city is actually studying and just issued this study just this week actually, what it would look like to do carbon trading, a carbon trading system. So that's a possibility in the future to kind of help add some flexibility on compliance. I'll skip the thing about kilowatt hours to GHG conversion factors on an annual or hourly basis. I think Sean is going to speak to that. You can deduct the output of on-site renewable energy from your annual emissions. So if you put on-site solar, you could deduct that, as well as deductions for clean storage and generation systems. Let's see, as far as affordable housing, they elected not to apply the greenhouse gas emissions limits to affordable housing, also houses of worship, and I should say affordable housing meaning rent regulated affordable housing. Instead, they have a list of prescriptive requirements that they need to abide by. The idea was they didn't want to overburden these properties. On the flip side, there was some criticism about that decision because you're leaving out those building owners. So last type, we use the term the trajectory approach for this. This is actually a policy model that IMT, we published a model ordinance for BPS last January, and the main feature of that is this trajectory approach. I'll talk about what that means in a second. So Denver, their building performance policy, which they expect to be adopted into law very soon, the building performance standard part of that policy features this model, and I'm sure Katrina will be speaking in more detail about Denver's policy, so we'll just touch on it here today. But Montgomery County, Maryland has also introduced legislation based on this approach. The basic features of this, the goal is to set a final long-term performance standard that to provide certainty to building owners on where they need to be to ultimately be in compliance. But because we don't want them just kicking the can down the road, setting interim performance standards recommended on about a 5-year basis, but it can vary based on your timelines and what you think is appropriate to make sure that progress is being made. Now, the reason we call it a trajectory approach is that you sort buildings into common types. So you'll sort offices together, multifamily together. You can subdivide from there, but just for sake of the example, supermarkets in a bucket as well. And then for those, you figure out, what is looking for in the future, the final standard we want based on our metrics. So site EUI is the metric that Denver chose and Montgomery County, Maryland chose for their policies, but you could do this with a different metric as well. Really anything but Energy Star score. And you take each building's performance on the baseline year, and you draw a line from their baseline performance to that final standard, which is common to all buildings within their type. And you draw a line, and that line tells you their performance trajectory. And every 5 years from that baseline to the final standard, or whatever your cadence is, you set an interim standard where you check their progress, and they're responsible for indicating, showing through their benchmarking reports that they're performing at that level. Otherwise, they need to pay an alternative compliance payment is the term we use in our ordinance. We recommend site energy use as a metric for this. Again, though, can be used for other metrics. For the purpose of electrification in our model ordinance, we do introduce the concept of an on-site metric, which would play with the site EUI. So it would be a dual metric approach, one metric for efficiency, another for electrification. There are other approaches to get electrification. Denver obviously has a different one where they're targeting electrification at time of equipment replacement. And Katrina can speak more about that. We also recommend, similar to the alternative compliance options I mentioned for the previous policies, we do the same in our ordinance. It's called the Building Performance Action Plan, but this again is an option for adding more flexibility, customization, especially for buildings that maybe are cash or income constrained, like affordable housing, have some sort of structural issue that makes it very difficult for them to achieve the targets. They need to amend their final standards, or any other reason that would be justified for an adjustment to their time frame or even their standard. So looking at Denver's, you can see they used a time frame of 2019 baseline and a 2030 timeframe for the BPS part of their policy. So this would cover buildings 25,000 square feet and up. Based on their site EUI, they've drawn lines for every covered property to a final standard, which is common to all buildings within a type. For mixed use buildings, it's a blended standard. Let's see. I guess Katrina, I presume you will be speaking more about the electrification and elements of the policy and the prescriptive requirements for the smaller buildings, so I'm not going to cover that. Montgomery County, Maryland, very much the same as Denver, just a slightly longer time frame. The only other thing I would mention, both Denver and Montgomery County are going to credit on-site solar investments against the building's energy use. And Denver is going to, as I understand it, Katrina, also credit off-site renewable energy purchases against that site EUI. One last thing to add on Denver, buildings that are subject to the BPS, which do choose to electrify their systems, that will be considered compliance with the final standard, because in almost every case, we expect that to meet the energy efficiency requirements we're looking for those buildings. So that was, in a nutshell, the presentation. I don't have, I feel like I took a little more time than I planned. Sean, do you want to walk us through the metrics?
Yes, thank you. So go ahead and go to the next one, please. So we'll go ahead and talk about the net metrics. Since you will all have these slides, I don't want to belabor our time too much by just reading through it, but I do want to highlight a couple of things from each metric as we go through here. So let's start with the Energy Star score. I think probably one of the biggest strengths is that it is very recognizable. But when we look at it, there is the element that it's a little bit of a black box. And so we don't always see performance and the Energy Star score don't always align. And we'll talk about that a little bit. That also means that there the number of inputs that go into the Energy Star score are actually both a strength and a weakness. It allows you to normalize based on factors like occupancy density and use and schedule, and there's a value to that. But that then means that you have all these variables that become part of enforcement. And so if they're not verified, then they become variables that can be used to either introduce errors into the system or even the opportunity for gamification. So we really have kind of a mixture of strengths and weaknesses. Go ahead and go in the next one. And site EUI, I think probably one of the big strengths of that is that it is very straightforward. All you need is energy and square footage, and you can calculate site. It's very understandable what it means. There's a direct correlation. However, not all site energy is the same when it comes down to it in terms of environmental impact. And this kind of calculation doesn't allow for any of these normalizations that we were just talking about in Energy Star. And you could do a normalized site energy, but then that adds some of that complexity back in and reduces this strength. There was a question in the chat about why you would move away from Energy Star to site when you're using Portfolio Manager. And I think it's important to distinguish between Energy Star and Portfolio Manager because they're not the same thing. Portfolio Manager allows you to gather the data, collate the data, do these kinds of normalization things that go into Energy Star. But out of Portfolio Manager, you can get other metrics. And so site energy is one of the other metrics that you can get out of it, since that's one of the inputs that goes into generating this entire system. So you are able to use Portfolio Manager to do all your data collection, data management, even if you're not using Energy Star scores. The next one we'll talk about is source. The big difference between site and source, and I don't want to belabor this too much, is just that source looks back to generation. And so anything that is used on site is going to have a lower source energy, and anything that comes to the offsite production. This is why we see when we look at source energy, electricity has a much higher value than say on-site combustion, because it has to go through production of electricity before you actually use it on site. It applies to all building types. It corresponds to emissions a little bit more directly than site does. It shouldn't be thought of as a correlation to emissions. We just see that it generally tends that direction more. We have the same issue with Portfolio Manager. It doesn't normalize this data yet. And also, the multiplier that you use to get from site to source can be an issue if you don't have a specific multiplier for your specific locality, because this varies from place to place. And then greenhouse gas intensity. I think one of the biggest strengths of this is the direct connection to climate goals. You're looking at climate impact, you're looking at greenhouse gases. I think probably the biggest obstacles and weaknesses with it really come down to the complexity of getting from the energy that you're consuming on site to what the actual greenhouse gas output is. The carbon intensity of electricity varies based on time of year, time of day. And so it's a complex thing to calculate. It's one of the reasons that we see in New York City that they kind of just, they did the best that they could, and then they stated it by fiat. And so if you just use that greenhouse gas intensity, if you want something that's really accurate, that means you have to start looking at time of use and when it's used, and you actually have to have the carbon conversion data for energy at certain times of day. So there's a complexity there. Otherwise, you're using this aggregate number. And then one thing that Zach touched on earlier, which is that greenhouse gas intensity puts a big variable in performance completely out of control of the building owners. So you have this element of, I can't control what the utility is going to do. If the utility is really aggressive in reducing emissions for their electricity supply, then that helps. And if they're less aggressive, then that hurts. And that makes that long-term planning a little bit more difficult. And I think that that's one barrier to keep in mind. Next. So I did want to dig into Energy Star to get at some of the things that we were talking about just a little bit more. So this is data that is actually from DC that we did some analysis of in preparation as they were talking about how to actually finalize their building performance standard. And so this is for multifamily buildings. This is their, this is actual performance data. And that line there is the requirement for the BPS. And the blue lines are the Energy Star scores. The orange are site energy, and the gray are source energy. And you see a pretty clear correlation between site and source, and that's to be expected. But what you don't see is a clear correlation between the energy used and the Energy Star score. So even though you can have, you don't have that high level of predictability. And if you go to the next one, we can look at this a different way. So PNNL, the Pacific Northwest National Labs, they're the ones who do the modeling for all of our model codes. They took one of their prototype buildings that they use to model the energy codes and how the energy codes are doing relative to each other. And they took the one for multifamily, and what you see here are a bunch of different variations on the same building prototype. They didn't change anything that changes kind of the actual performance, the site energy, the outputs of the model, but they did change variables that go into the Energy Star score. And so buildings that are, from a modeling standpoint, identical, delivered a radically wide range of Energy Star scores. And so this is one of those things that we get into, that that variability and that connection. Go ahead and go to the next one. And this is just office buildings showing a similar thing. The range is narrower, but we still do see that range. And go ahead and go to the next one. And here we have the looking similar to that first one. And again, for offices, that the Energy Star scores varying and the connection with site. I think this is a good point to also bring up something else that interrelates metrics and target setting, which is, so we started with the full data set of DC disclosure data. And the reason that there are only, 9 buildings, 10 buildings in this data set is these were all the buildings where the data integrity was high enough to do this kind of analysis. So as you're looking at target setting, the data that you have to work from becomes very important. The more specific you are and the more aggressive you are with the targets means that the higher quality data needs to go into the process. So if you're doing a trajectory approach, you need to have very high quality data about the individual buildings so that you have that good starting point. If you're going to be very aggressive with your goals, then the total population data, if it's going to be based on where buildings are, you need to have good quality data on that. And so the data that you get in, the reason that this ties back to metrics is some of the simpler metrics are easier to get higher quality data on. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. And another issue that comes up with metrics in general, but particularly with site EUI, this just shows the distribution of loads from a 2010 ASHRAE building to a 2013 ASHRAE building. And this is just meant to show kind of the trend that purple wedge of the pie, which is equipment, when you think of a plug loads, these are the things that the code doesn't regulate, is steadily growing as a proportion of total building performance and energy consumption, while these regulated portions, the green, the orange, and the blue, continue to shrink because those are regulated loads. Those are what the code actually addresses. And so as you're looking at particularly energy-based metrics, recognizing that you will increasingly be affecting these equipment loads. And so a consideration should be made for those are the sorts of loads that buildings will increasingly have to contend with as you get closer to new construction targets, levels of performance. But it also means that those are loads that are going to be impacted by other policies. Appliance standards for computers and televisions and all of those things are going to impact that as well. And the normal alterations for lighting and HVAC equipment replacements are also going to be bringing this consumption down at the same time that the BPS is working on it. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. And this is just to give a little bit of overall context. So for climate zone 4A, what we see in here is the kind of yellowish gold is what new construction in climate zone 4A would look like. And for a zero energy level of performance. compared to the orange, which is 90.1 2016, versus the dark blue, which is kind of the a standard existing building and standard 100. And what this just shows is that the level of difference that you can see and how it varies from building type to building type, depending on which kind of data set you're drawing your targets from. Go ahead and go to the next one. And I know that this is mostly about metrics, but there's a high level of interaction between metrics and targets. And so one of the things that we wanted to bring up about greenhouse gases and carbon, this is an unidentified municipality that is looking at a BPS and basing it on carbon. And that gray stepping line that you see there, those were the targets that they were thinking of using in their building performance standard. But this is a municipality with a rapidly decarbonizing grid. And so those orange lines are what the emissions intensity would look like for the 10th percentile of their building stock, 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th percentile, just due to the decarbonizing grid. And what you see is not until 2050 did the BPS actually have any impact, because it was greenhouse gas based, because it was carbon based, all of those buildings, their emissions were reducing simply because of the grid. And so this is something to consider for greenhouse gas or carbon based metrics, is that there is that interplay, means that targets have to be set aggressively enough, that if you want to get efficiency, they need to be set aggressively enough to stay ahead of wherever the grid is in terms of decarbonization. And if they're not set more aggressively, then your BPS effectively becomes an electrification policy, because if all buildings have to do to comply is electrify, there's going to be a strong incentive to do that. And so we wanted to bring this up as just one of those realities of those interactions. And I think we have one other version of this, just looking at what this looks like for multifamily. So in this municipality, it would have happened earlier for multifamily, but you still see the same basic issue. Go ahead and go to the next slide. There are other metrics and even more beyond this. And I just wanted to identify that these other metrics do exist. They have their own sets of strengths and weaknesses. But when we look at what the market is ready for, maybe the market isn't quite ready for these, but we wanted to at least have them on your radar and here for your reference as you think about the sorts of things that can be accomplished by using different metrics. And we have one more to talk specifically about electrification. And each one of these is going to have a different impact on how much the BPS incentivizes electrification. So with something like site EUI, you will have a mild incentive to electrify. And that's just because electric equipment on a site basis is more efficient than gas equipment on a site basis. And so there will be at least a mild incentive to electrify. When you look at high performance heat pumps, that gap gets even bigger. So there is some incentivization to electrification, but it's not direct. Source energy will actually disincentivize electrification because of the source multiplier for electricity. This is a little bit dependent on where that source multiplier ends up over time, because that is something that varies, but that is something to keep in mind. Therefore, the Energy Star score, since it's based on source energy, will do the same thing. There will be a disincentivization for electrification. Greenhouse gas intensity, of course, has anywhere that the grid is decarbonizing, there's going to be an incentive to electrify. That market signal will get stronger anytime the decarbonization of the electrical supply is happening faster, more aggressively, and that signal will be weaker whenever it's happening slower. We are right now to the point that if you're talking about heat pump conversions, even in the dirtiest grid in the United States, you get a carbon benefit from going from retrofitting from gas to high performance heat pumps. But that's not resistance. So there's the efficiency gain that comes in there that you get from heat pumps. And then the last bullet is what we were talking about with matching those targets to that to the metric and making sure what you want to actually accomplish, how much you want to get just electrification and how much you want to also get efficiency out of it. So I think hopefully we have some time for questions now.
That was fantastic. Thank you both so much. I think we're a little bit past when we had you booked. We're happy to, you guys are a wealth of knowledge, so I would love to leverage that while we have you. So if you do have a few minutes, then I think there are a couple questions that came up in the chat that we'd love to.
Originally, I was going to have to leave, but actually now I get to stay. So you have as long as you need me, and I believe Zach was able to stay as well.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Jim, you've got your hand raised if you want to kick us off, and then I know several of you threw some questions in the chat, so we'll go through those in order of when they came, and if you have any clarifying comments or want to add to your question, then as we bring it up, then you can do so.
My only comment really is to keep whatever we end up with here simple to be implemented easily. I think we all are more expert than your average person that's going to be implementing these for buildings. We got to keep in mind that those property management, facility management folks, their heads might spin if what we come up with is too complicated. So just digesting all of what was just presented, I sort of favor the site EUI as the metric, just because it encourages electrification more and it's simple.
Great, yeah, and we'll dive deep into all those different ideas and thoughts. So thank you. We wrote that one down. I know there was a question in the beginning, and this might be for you, Zach, but it was in regards to Washington, D.C. What happens if a building follows the performance path, but the EUI does not reduce by 20%? Oh, you're muted.
You're not muted, but we can't hear you. There we go.
I double muted.
Yeah.
In that case, they would not be in compliance, and they'd pay an alternative compliance payment.
Okay. Okay. Great. Thanks. And then there was a question. Someone was curious whether technical assistance is provided to building owners to help them achieve compliance when they fail to meet targets, or do they just impose fines and increase compliance?
So that's something that certainly a lot of jurisdictions want to do. Katrina can speak to the plans that they have for that, which are quite extensive. Speaking for DC, they have what's called the DC Building Innovation Hub, which is a technical assistance kind of clearinghouse of information that helps building owners understand what are the policy requirements, connects them with the consultants, engineers, others who can help, including incentive programs run through the DC Sustainable Energy Utility. And all the jurisdictions that are pursuing this or that have BPS or are pursuing it are thinking about what kind of technical assistance can we provide? How do we leverage utility programs or financing programs that already exist to help people do this?
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's great to know that there's opportunity and thought behind that as well. Great, so then in regard to New York City, how do prescriptive measures reduce the burden of compliance on below market rate housing providers?
You can select measures that you're relatively sure pay back, that are not going to be big capital expenditures for those properties, things like that.
Great, perfect. And then it sounded like Sean answered the question about Energy Star score and portfolio manager, but there was a question, how would measurement and compliance look outside Energy Star score? And Joel, correct me if I'm wrong, if that was what that was the question you were asking.
Yeah, let me add some clarification. Thank you, Sean, for your presentation. That really helped clarify things in my mind. But I'm wondering if we were to go the EUI route, like site EUI, how would we measure that and enforce compliance? Because it doesn't sound like asking a building owner to run a calculation themselves is very practical.
So if you're using Portfolio Manager as kind of the data acquisition mechanism, then Portfolio Manager will calculate it for you. And it's a simpler calculation to Energy Star, so it's a simple output that you get out from any building. If it's something that is going to be done outside of Portfolio Manager, and I know that that's, you know, as you're putting together one of these policies, how you get the data becomes a very important question. You know, you can always ask them to enter those two variables separately. Since the calculation is what is your annual total energy, what is your square footage, divide the one by the other. So hopefully that calculation is simple enough. But you know, and anytime you introduce a calculation, of course, there is an opportunity for inaccuracies. So it's a matter of, do you just want the raw information and let the policy calculate the site UI for you, or do you just ask them to do it and trust that it's simple enough that your users are going to be able to do that?
Perfect, thank you. Great. Have you seen any credits for demand reduction or demand flexibility?
I don't think we have. Have you, Zach?
I mean, there's not like demand response type things, but Sean mentioned the peak demand metric as a kind of forward-looking metric, and IMT also, you know, we've kind of posited that as something that we don't really expect anyone to pick up at the moment for a number of technical challenges. So no, not really. New York might be the closest.
Yeah, there are metrics that effectively get to that. The peak demand is one. Any type of time-dependent valuation. Of course, these add complexity to your metric. It could be integrated on a policy standpoint where you could just make a less of a technical decision and more of a policy decision that buildings that meet a certain demand responsiveness criteria could receive a certain credit against whatever target they're reaching. And I think that that's one of the important parts for putting one of these policies together is recognizing that there's a difference between your technical questions and your policy questions. You know, sometimes you can make choices that you don't need a heavy data driven response to. You just need to be well informed because you really want to incentivize something. And so the decision about doing something like a credit for demand responsiveness could be driven by how much you want to incentivize demand responsiveness.
So there's a question from Eric Jeanette. If we go with site UI, what if a new office building is built in 2022 and then each year they perform tenant finishes and get more tenants, so every year the UI increases? So this goes to that normalizing for what's going on in the building. You know, as far as like adding tenants or you know, the density of occupancy, I know that Energy Star Portfolio Manager is thinking very hard about adding normalization capability to their EUI metrics. So there was a meeting in June that they invited a number of policymakers to. I know that they're also continuing to work on this, and so I would expect there's a very good chance of that capability being added over the next year or two. There's a question.
I think there's also kind of two questions there. One is how you deal with vacancy, and one is how you deal with use intensity. With vacancy, you know, you can address that through having that be one of the inputs for compliance. What was the vacancy over the course of the year? Now, and this is probably going to be more important for new construction. For intensity, part of that gets down to where you set the targets. There are certain targets that you can set, and you can say, well, even a really intensely used building should still, you know, we're setting the requirement in a place that even intensely used buildings will meet if they are reasonably efficient. And that kind of normalization for use intensity within a building type becomes more important as the targets get more and more aggressive. And so that's another one of those calibrating your targets issues to keep in mind is, you know, as you get more aggressive with your targets, those sorts of things become more important.
There's a follow-up question too about industrial buildings, and they're growing in their manufacturing production. So most jurisdictions do not cover manufacturing facilities under their building performance standards. That's typically exempted.
And that's the case for our statute as well.
Thanks.
Perfect. I think we'll take a couple more questions and then we'll make sure that we have grabbed everybody's if there's any extra, but there's a question on, can you discuss more about greenhouse gas metrics and the need to stay ahead of the grid greening? How have other jurisdictions tackled this?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's one element of, you need to stay ahead of it if you want to push efficiency and not just electrification. So I think that that's an important piece of it. And luckily, a lot of the utilities, and I know Excel doesn't cover all of Colorado, but covers a lot, and it has a long-term plan that is fairly well laid out. So maybe it's a little bit more predictable than some other places. But how other jurisdictions have handled this is through lots and lots of work. That was basically what New York City did, bringing in lots of stakeholders, lots of experts to really look at the information and have an in-depth discussion about how to set this in a reasonable and equitable way. And I think that maybe some of those stakeholders will have different opinions about how well that process went.
Great. Perfect. And then there is a question, how does a building owner control building EUI if tenants are the ones increasing energy use?
So there's a couple of ways to handle it. One is through the leasing, and where you talk about whose responsibilities are what. And then there is the reality that even though there is this split between what the building is capable of doing and what it actually does based on how it's used, a lot of these capital features of buildings are within an owner's control. So making sure that the equipment in the building isn't super inefficient, so that it is at least able to be operated efficiently. And then this again ties back to the targets that, is the target set where any reasonable use of the building is going to meet the target for a reasonably efficient building, or are you pushing harder than that, where you really do start to get into your tenants have to start having a certain kind of behavior in order to get to compliance, and then dealing with it through green leasing or other agreements between tenant and owner become more important.
Yeah, I just add to that. Well, one, green leasing, we've been working on language to align incentives for compliance with BPS. But obviously that's at the time of lease negotiations as you put those in place. But Christine mentioned in the comments that in Denver they have the alternative compliance option where you can adjust your limits for intensive use. That's that compliance path is meant to kind of provide an off ramp for these sort of unusual situations. The challenge then becomes managing that ramp so it doesn't become overwhelming. So you have to design your rules thoughtfully around that.
Great. Perfect. Well, yeah, I think we captured all of that. And if any additional questions come up, feel free to send them our way. And hopefully we can connect with Zach and Sean too to make sure that we get those questions answered. Great. I just saw another one as well. Perfect. Julia, I will hand it over to you. I think I'll let you share next steps.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, well, Zach and Sean, if you do, I know Christine, Katrina, and Eric all had their hands raised. So I think there's a few more questions, but are you all right, the three of you, if we get answers and get responses to you as we did with the memo on all of the questions that came up in the last meeting, or are these quick things that we might be able to answer now? I just want to be respectful of Zach and Sean's time.
Just add a quick follow-up to that last comment is all. It's an interesting point that was brought up, if the tenants are increasing energy use and we're watching site EUI, and we saw from the graph presented previously that our HVAC and lighting energy use is decreasing over time, and our plug loads are increasing in terms of the pie chart. How do we manage that if our efficiency of our systems are getting better, but our plug loads are kind of the more dominant part of the equation? So I don't have any answers. I just wanted to add that comment onto the last thought, because I think it's interesting for us to consider.
I think to make sure, so that's for new buildings. So it's getting a smaller, the plug loads is getting a bigger and bigger proportion of new buildings. And presumably your new buildings are going to be the ones that are going to have the easiest time getting to your BPS ultimate target.
And I was just going to quickly chime in, Julia, with an answer to some of the questions, because people are asking how Denver's doing some of this, and just to add just a couple little things. So that, like some folks have said, if necessary, a building can adjust their end target. But also, if a building shifts from one usage type to another, for example, a data center tenant moves in, data centers have a different target than offices. And so the building would then, the target would change if the use type changed to align with the new use type. We have that flexibility to make that kind of shift. And I'll also note, because I think somebody asked about a warehouse, there are warehouses where the building owner has almost no say over any part of energy management or energy systems. Tenants own everything. But under leases, the tenant does have to comply with local law. So even if a building owner hasn't taken the steps to implement requirements in the lease that the tenant implement efficient systems, the owner can tell the tenant they still have to comply with the law, and the tenant has to follow the law. So we don't have a huge problem. Like, yes, leases can help so that tenants have accurate expectations about what they're going to have to do in their space. We have a whole smart leasing program to support that, but leases are set up for success for this.
Thank you for that, Katrina. And we'll do a quick break after we wrap all these questions up, and then probably actually open it up to you again to share a little bit more, if you don't mind. And Kara as well, if you are still willing, we'd love to kind of have you share a little bit about just your deeper experience with New York City and some of the approaches that were taken there. There are, Jim, I see your hand, so I'll get you in just a second, but there was one more question in the chat that I think was a high priority one to go over right now, which is just Bill's question that if there's a data center client increasing load from 2 megawatts to 10 megawatts of IT load, how have other jurisdictions handled this? And I think, Katrina, you may have in some ways answered this a little bit, but in that case, it's still a data center as a data center. So it's just that they are increasing their loads significantly. So Zach, if you have any case studies or examples of how other jurisdictions have handled that, is that tenant or that building then exempt?
Unfortunately, there are no examples of case studies because compliance isn't really started anywhere except arguably DC this year. But DC just released its final program rules this week, so we just don't know exactly. I can't point to exactly how things have played out. However, Katrina's answer, I think, is how most places would approach it.
Okay, great.
And I think there's two general conceptual ways to approach it. One is to make sure that the policy has a built-in mechanism for adjusting targets for unusual situations, for the atypical building. And then that becomes a catch-all for everything, whether it's an unusual load, an unusual schedule, an unusual density, a typology that doesn't fit any of the typical typologies. For these kinds of process loads specifically, another option is to allow for process loads to be metered separately, and then for those loads to be deducted from the whole building load, so that you can see everything non-process. And so you could do that. I mean, if you had industrial or manufacturing, you could do it that way, but something like that would apply to data centers. Newer buildings, depending on which code they're built under, some of the new construction codes are beginning to require this kind of load segregation and sub-metering in the code. But also a lot of times these loads are so significant, they are already segregated within the building. But that puts the onus on the owner to actually meter these loads separately so that they can be treated separately.
I think that gets to John's comment in the chat there as well regarding the downtown high rise. Jim, and then Christine, and then I think we'll, please still feel free to send your questions. Zach and Sean, if you don't mind, we'll share those with you via email and then see if we can get any other responses.
Yeah, that sounds fine.
My comment is sort of a similar separate metering thing that Sean was just talking about. And it's kind of an elephant in the room issue for every building going forward. And that issue is electric vehicle charging. As we all know, and as Will mentioned early on today's call, EV purchases and use and charging are going to go up dramatically over the next few years. And most buildings, some of the ones that we own actually, they just are connected to a few circuits on a miscellaneous panel, house panel. They're not metered separately. I think that building codes need to address this, and maybe our building performance standards also need to address this, because we're going to have drastically higher electric use for every building as soon as they start charging their vehicles.
Thank you, Jim. Noted. Definitely. Christine?
For the site EUI trajectory approach, if you have a building that has multiple use types within it, like an office on the upper floors and a restaurant on the lower floors, does the EUI just reflect that? And so you don't just take the majority.
No, it's a
calculate
blended.
it in there.
Yeah, so it's a blended average, basically. So the building owner enters into portfolio manager, you know, all the different property use types within the building, and then you can assign, you know, you basically create a blended target based on the targets for each one.
I think that addresses at least half the concerns about different uses within a building.
Zach, can you talk about how that then those changing uses over time, you adjust the target, but how you would adjust the starting point in a trajectory to account for that? Because if you have a building that starts with one distribution of types, that beginning point then only becomes valid for that specific combination of uses.
Yeah, you would have to go through a alternative compliance path and negotiate that with the jurisdiction.
Zach, is that based on square footage? When a use type changes like that?
Yes.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much again to Zach and Sean for your time. We really, really appreciate it. For the task force members, what we'll do is actually get the slides from Zach and Sean up on Monday.com like pretty much immediately following this meeting, so that you all can go through those. And then if you have any additional questions for Zach and Sean that we might want to get answered before the next task force meeting, or just to kind of inform us as we think about these things between this meeting and the next, then please send them to myself and Diane and Kim, or put them up on Monday.com. That might be the easiest thing. We'll just get a thread going for those questions. We'll collect those and we'll send them over to Zach and Sean, if you guys would be willing to just shoot us some quick email responses on those. We'll try to collect them and send like just one email with all of the questions. There may be some follow-ups after we get your first round of responses. So I'm thinking we'll put kind of a timeline in there when we add this to Monday. So perhaps if we can get your initial thoughts by like, well, next week's the holiday, but you know, so by like Wednesday of next week, and then we can send them over to Zach and Sean, give them a little time to get responses, and then we'll send them, post them back on Monday for you all. Great. All right. Well, thank you both again. We really, really appreciate your time and expertise. Yeah, a little round of silent applause as we're all muted. Yeah, thank you so much. We're going to take a quick break, 5 minutes, just to let you stretch your legs before our last 50 minutes of our discussion today. So I think if we could all come back here at 2:40, we'll dive into kind of starting to discuss some of these issues among ourselves and questions and start to think about what what lessons learned we can apply for Colorado, as well as what what maybe doesn't make sense. And we'll start that off with Katrina and Kara sharing a little bit, if you guys don't mind. So we'll see you back here in about, I guess now 4 minutes. So well, I'll give you 5, 2:41. Thank you all.
Perfect. Julia, I'm sorry. I'm sharing my screen, correct? Great, thanks. No, you're fine. I got it. Thank you.
I'm going to go through the chat and try and make sure we captured everything.
Perfect. That sounds great. I hope I did. And I forget that Kim does get like a transcript at the end.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
All right, great. A couple people have hopped back on. If you are back at your computer, if you wouldn't mind turning that screen back on, or just giving us a little wave, raising something like that, so we know you're here. Great. All right, awesome. Thanks, guys. Perfect. Well, actually, so the next part of the conversation, Jeff and myself, we're going to go over metrics a little bit more. But I think, I don't think I have anything to add beyond what Sean shared there. I think he did a really great job, and we can dive in. I think our time is really better used in discussion. But Jeff, really quick, did you have anything that you wanted to add, or just based on your experience working with different building owners on metrics or anything?
I guess I don't personally. Mark is also on the call, and he's been looking into this. So I guess, Mark, do you have anything else to add? Or?
No, I was absorbing the back and forth and some of the issues. I thought of a few of my own, but I think we've touched on processes, process loads, data centers, vehicle charging, all of which are sort of implicitly covered in Portfolio Manager, but just something that we need to take into account so that people aren't penalized for adding more vehicle charging stations, for example, or large hospitals or restaurants, other sites with large process loads, even if they're not manufacturing or industrial sites.
Absolutely. I think that'll be something for us to dig into in our coming meetings. We've got plenty more.
Yeah, I mean, even just data centers alone is its own issue. So.
Kirk, yeah, please.
I'd also just add to that list of, things to work on is occupancy, how we kind of address occupancy and the fluctuating occupancy levels in buildings. So it's a tough nut to crack with Portfolio Manager.
I think I'd love to turn it over first to Katrina and then Kara. Katrina, I know you already spoke a little bit about kind of the approach that you've all taken in Denver, but I wonder if you might speak a little bit more on why you took the approach you did in terms of the metrics. And I'm happy to, if you'd like to, I'm happy to kind of put IMT slides back up there about Denver, or if you want to just speak to it, that's fine.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I could just speak to it. So, and I won't restate the things IMT covered. You heard, I think, a really good summary from them on our performance policy, with the EY target, and the reason we settled on that metric, with it being one that's really easily reportable out of Energy Star Portfolio Manager. It's really measurable. It's something a building owner can kind of keep track of over the course of a year if they wanted, and really manage to, because it's something that they can measure and manage to as they monitor energy use. And so our Energize Denver task force that designed our policy with us really settled on that energy use intensity, site energy use intensity target. The thing that Zach didn't cover, and he sort of just deferred that I would cover it later, so I will, about our policy is that performance target with a 30% improvement in energy performance to reach an EY targets for every building type by 2030 gets us about 2/3 of the emission reductions from our full performance policy. And we have electrification requirements that get us another 1/3 of our performance requirement, or the overall savings from the performance requirements. And so I just thought I'd cover those briefly. And if you're interested, I could sort of share a slide walking through those, but we basically phase in requirements to electrify existing building space and water heating systems when those systems are replaced, when it's cost effective to electrify those systems. So we're actually going to change our permitting process so that starting in 2025 for some system types and in 2027 for other system types, it is required to install a heat pump instead of a gas system for space and water heating systems across all commercial and multifamily buildings. I'm happy to go in more depth, but that's kind of the other piece of this. And I'm happy to just kind of have discussion around some of the technical details also, but that's the other kind of big performance policy. It's a bit prescriptive in nature, right? But it drives building performance in a significant way.
Thanks so much, Katrina. And just to address one of the questions in the chat, just so everyone does know, about 25% of the buildings that would be covered under the state's BPS are in Denver and are also then covered by Denver's BPS. So just something to be aware of there. Christine, I saw you had a hand. And so.
I was going to add that Denver's policy requires 30% improvement by 2030, and it applies to buildings 25,000 square feet and up, whereas ours applies to buildings 50,000 square feet and up. So there's two different measures where ours could follow the same path as Denver without necessarily needing to be as stringent and still hit the goals, depending on all the final calculations, et cetera.
Great, Kirk.
I was wondering if you could share a little bit more, Katrina, about alternative pathways and any, oftentimes in these conversations, we try to solve for all buildings, but that's just not realistic. So I'm curious if your task force kind of talked about some of the outlier scenarios and how you address that through variances or alternative pathways.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have 4 alternate compliance pathways. One is to apply to adjust the compliance timeline for the buildings. We have binding interim targets in 2024 and in 2027 that lead to the final target in 2030. And so building owners can apply to adjust the timeline if they have done, and there's some criteria around that. They have to have a plan for when they will meet the target. They have to have done quick payback items that would be easy to do right away, or have a reason that they can't do those. And all those details are in the rules and regs that will get finalized next month. We have kind of a special path for affordable housing, which often cannot get capital to make improvements unless they're at the time of refinancing the building. And so then they could defer compliance until they are going through a refinance process and can get the capital. And so there's a few reasons, but they really do have to go and kind of make the easy improvements and then have a very detailed plan for how to reach the same end target, but on a different timeline. And we'll be spending a lot of resources coaching buildings to do that if they can't reach the 2024 target in particular, because that's coming really soon. And then we have a whole process that will stand up where they can adjust that final end target. So we do have a blended target for buildings that are a mix of building types, but if for some reason there are inherent characteristics of a building that make it so it simply can't reach that same final target, there'll be a standard engineering analysis that the building owner can hire out and go through to adjust their final target. And for example, a lot of, we've already talked with our airport, a lot of their buildings are just not standard buildings. They're going to have to go through a process of setting custom targets for a lot of those buildings. We will do our best based off data we have about those buildings to set targets. To the question about hospitals, we have 3 hospitals in Denver. We're also looking at national data. So we're not just setting targets based off the 2019 data from 3 hospitals. And we will do our best to set a feasible target for hospitals. If one of them thinks they can't reach that, they'll have to go through this alternate compliance path to adjust their end goal based on like a real engineering analysis of what is and isn't achievable in that building. And you'll recall that solar fully offsets against your EUI. So I hope not that many buildings end up needing these alternate compliance pathways, because they can either put solar on site or buy solar off site if they can't hit the efficiency targets. And I don't know that that works as well. I need to still wrap my brain around how much solar could really count towards compliance given the rules of this ordinance. So if someone else has wrapped their brain around that for this group, feel free to speak to it. But I do think solar is going to be a really big strategy for compliance for buildings that, like that's one of the things they would have to show is why they can't install solar panels or buy offsite solar if they need a different end goal. And then the other two alternate compliance paths, sorry to cover them, they're more brief. We do include manufacturing and industrial. We will write their own set of rules. So that is a totally separate compliance path. They're just excluded from everybody else's. And we have, Zach mentioned it, but a bit incorrectly, the buildings that are 25,000 to 100,000 square feet, just for 2024 and 2027, can electrify and do a lighting upgrade, and they are in compliance. They do still have to hit their 2030 target. But that should get most buildings to their 2030 target. So if they don't want to do the brain damage of managing to a target EUI, they can electrify and do a lighting upgrade.
So it was my understanding, Katrina, and sorry, maybe this is offline, but EUI was just load. It was just the building consumption, and solar was backed out of that. Did I misunderstand that?
Let me see if I can restate, because I'm not sure what the way you're saying it either. So your EUI is energy use per square foot per year. And
just the building's consumption, not any on-site generation.
For all the buildings consumption. And then we will take any solar on-site or off-site and just subtract it from your energy use. It comes straight off the top of energy use. So solar directly lowers energy use per square foot per year. So it directly counts towards how you hit your EUI targets in Denver. Montgomery County did the same thing as Zach mentioned.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
Could I ask a follow-up question on that? Just want to make sure that I understand, as the background grid decarbonizes and the incremental benefits from solar compared to the background grid get smaller, does the Denver approach apply any corrections, or it's still just a one-to-one for the solar?
It's one-to-one for solar, and in part that's because we know the grid will be 80% renewable by 2030. We have a goal to be 100% renewable by 2030, and buildings are part of how we're going to close that gap. So it's just part of how we want more solar capacity installed in Denver, because that's how we fill the gap between where the grid is at and where Denver's at. We'll count all the extra capacity and all the extra contracts in Denver towards our 100% goal.
Okay, thanks.
Karen and then Christine.
I just had a question about how we handle, and this is for everyone, but also in Denver's building performance standards, that we are designing our new buildings. We have always designed our large format buildings, regardless of use, to use as much summertime energy as possible by surrounding the west and south sides by parking lots. So we are designing them to use the maximum, and electrification, we don't want them to use any kind of energy. And that's not offset by solar. And I'm wondering, and I need help with this, I'm representing the communities who don't have a building performance standard. How do I get the design better so that we are not heating up our buildings with hardscape all summer long and causing them to use max? And that got to the demand some. I thought maybe that could be part of that peak demand too. So I was wondering how you handled that, if that makes sense.
It does. I'm not sure I have the full solution, so I'll toss it to the group in a moment. But Denver is doing a lot of work on building codes also. And so we are updating our codes. Our current 2019 Denver building code is 15% more efficient than the national IECC 2018 code was. So we adopted a bunch of Denver amendments to be 15% better. We'll be doing another code update in 2022, the first half of 2022, to take another step towards net zero buildings in code. And so our buildings more and more buildings will have to take the modeled path through code, which means they'll be trying to, we're moving in the direction, and we'll see if we go all the way there in 2022 towards having new buildings actually also modeling to hit a certain predicted EUI And then that's what will translate into the building performance policy as their baseline to the target. And it should, you know, under our codes in 2019, even, it should be pretty easy for those new buildings to hit the performance targets, but that doesn't get to sort of like, are they still putting parking lots on the south side? So I don't know.
I think that's a good point, Karen, and good to bring up. I think that new buildings would be incentivized to be designed fairly efficient. And if they are meeting the latest codes, they will kind of by default be fairly efficient. But they'll want to make sure they don't have to turn around in 5 or 10 years and make upgrades in order to meet this statute. So I think that that sort of Western and solar exposure might be something they might look at. And we know that Excel has free design modeling, energy modeling for every building, every new construction building, or maybe just large ones, I don't remember. So they could get all that figured out ahead of time for free. But before you mentioned that, I had a comment back to the solar discussion. I think that Denver's approach with solar, how solar is credited towards their BPS, I think that would fit within the statute as I read it, because the statute was written so that a building owner couldn't just get credit for the grid by default getting cleaner through utility actions. The idea was for actions that building owners take in regards to their own building would count. And a building owner either putting solar on their own roof or paying for offsite solar is a building action, not something that the utility is just doing totally separately. So I think that could fit within what we're allowed to do.
Great, thanks. Jim, I'll throw it to you for the last, or Jim and then Kirk, and then I want to open it up to Kara to speak briefly about New York City. And then what we're going to do is hopefully, I think we should have time. We're going to pull up another Miro board and just kind of get gut reaction thoughts that some of you have on some of these different pathways that we could go down in terms of ESPM versus site UI, hearing a lot about that. I think those are kind of the two main ones that it sounds like this group is considering, but we've also, you know, if you have thoughts on GHGI and things like that as well. So Jen, Kirk, and then let's open it up to Kara.
Yeah, related to the solar issue we were just discussing, I used to do a lot of community solar, worked with Will years ago on Boulder County's first one under the Excel program. And I know that Denver counts offsite solar, but we had a lot of discussions internally at the Clean Energy Collective when I was with them about should we have subscribers, and Karen, you and I had some of these discussions too, should we have subscribers tag on to existing solar gardens, because those solar gardens are already built. And if what we're trying to do is encourage more solar production, maybe we clarify that offsite solar needs to be new constructed solar, not just in like a trading thing where somebody wants to sell their share in a solar garden for a profit, and that gives somebody compliance that's not complying as a building. Similar comment regarding carbon trading and RECs. I think we need to clarify what is our overall goal. Do we want to be producing new energy efficiency and green energy versus just trading for existing capacity?
Great questions. And Kirk has one in the chat that's related just briefly in how Denver plans to handle it. We do count any new capacity or any contract for capacity is our plan for what we would count. So that could be a contract with an existing solar garden. I think it would be a little hard, but I'll have to think about it more for us to regulate like how recently the solar garden was built in terms of what counts for a contract. But we don't give credit for something like wind source where you're just signing up for kilowatt hours. It has to be a contract for kilowatts actual capacity. We don't give credit for RECs. To Kirk's question, what we want is more contracts or actual installed capacity in Denver.
Great. Will, did you have a follow-up on that specific?
It's a thought sort of related to this that this has sparked. And this is really a question about the data that we'll have through Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Do we have the ability to separately report out the site energy use intensity from on-site fossil combustion and from electricity, or do we only get a blended mix of that?
You could certainly report them separately. We get the data from Energy Star Portfolio Manager for every fuel used. So electricity, we get kilowatt hours used, therms of gas, chilled water and steam. And so you could calculate if you wanted. It wouldn't be given to you by Portfolio Manager, but you could put each of those into KBTUs and divide them by per square foot per year and get an EUI per fuel if you wanted quite easily. What Portfolio Manager gives you is site EUI for the whole building. It takes all 4 fuels and puts them into site EUI.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Kara, if you don't mind, I'm gonna put you on the spot for a minute just to kind of reflect on New York, and I think they've taken a fairly unique approach in the greenhouse gas metric. So.
Of course, yeah, I'm happy to share. What a fun conversation. This is really interesting and exciting. So in New York, GHG based, we did a fairly deep dive on the carbon value of demand flexibility there. And what I guess the most relevant kind of key finding in our analysis, and I'm happy to go deeper into this, was that having the GHG emissions based on an annual average metric actually incents very different operating habits in buildings than if you were doing it on a real-time marginal 15-minute basis. And so the load profiles look very different for an annual average compliance metric than they would for like what's actually happening in real time on the grid. And so I think, I guess my perspective, and just to root this, I think I'm also leaning in the site EUI trajectory camp, but it gets really complex and nuanced. And I don't know, there's just that interaction with grid, being able to exchange real-time information so that buildings actually can shift their load based on when there's renewable generation on the grid. It's A, really important, and B, pretty challenging today, just with current metering requirements between buildings and current data exchange between buildings and the grid. So I think we were looking at kind of the 100% right answer solution if we were to go all the way and have like real-time marginal emissions data that we could shift loads based on. That does make a big difference. And in a clean grid, it can reduce carbon emissions by 40%, kind of in the end goal. So I think, I guess I would just say that there's a lot of opportunity, I think, in kind of managing our buildings better to incent better renewable utilization on the grid. I think there will be more opportunities forthcoming. I'll stop there.
Any thoughts or questions on that approach or kind of what Kara has shared? Yeah, Mark, please go ahead. I think you're muted.
Yeah, the space bar wasn't working down here. I mean, the calculation of GHG emissions in real time would give us a more accurate answer. But I would ask, how does that translate into codes? How does that translate into action? Because the building operator would have to have access to that information and then be able to make decisions on the fly. And how many building operators would have the ability to either shed load or choose their source of energy, toggling between what and what. So,
well, I think we have, oh, sorry.
Go on.
You finished. I think we have some precedent today to do this in demand response programs. I think nationwide DR program participation is like 10%. It's pretty low. And so I think that's also very manual. So to make real-time data align, and to make real-time data available and align with carbon emissions and enable load shifting at the building level, it needs to be automated, and we need to have better signals between buildings and the utilities. I think most buildings at the scale that we're talking about here, 50,000 square feet and above, likely have, some level of building automation, BAS, hopefully BMS systems. So I think potential is there today. I think the interoperability is a challenge still.
But I think you would also need to tie that to a price signal to get people to motivate to participate. They cannot be independent.
That's true. And there is time of use pricing, I know, in Excel and other utilities throughout the state. So I think that's coming. It's probably not all the way where we would want it to be, but.
If I could digress on that point, one of the barriers we find implementing solar is in fact Excel's SG rate that penalizes or has a very high demand charge and a very low energy charge that PV does not help. So there's a price signal breakdown that essentially penalizes PV. It's much better for the residential homeowner that doesn't have the demand charge. So we need to align our price signals to our GHG signals.
Will, did you have a question, or was your hand still up from previously?
Sorry.
Oh, great. No, you're fine. No worries. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, related to that SG comment, I would put in a plug for demand management systems. We've been doing that on recent buildings instead of solar. It's much more cost effective, and it certainly has a much better payback. So definitely a plug for DM systems.
Great. Any other? Oh, go ahead, Julia.
Sorry, I just wanted to know, I have gotten a couple messages from people that your invite said 1 to 3. We did extend this to 3:30. I think maybe that message may not have come through for everyone, or because of the wonkiness with having to do webinar links and everything. So apologies. We are going to continue until 3:30. If you're able to stay on, we really appreciate it, but we also understand that you may have already had conflicts. So yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to follow up. It seems like conceptually and not getting down into the technical of how to do it, if there's a standard requirement that's more simple, but if an individual building wants to take the more complex route of when they're actually using energy from the grid in a 24-hour period, and that's achieving the same thing, that, that would be just another route they could get to the same performance. Wouldn't be required, but it could be allowed.
I might just add, there's the way we got at what Kara's talking about is deferring and relying on Xcel Energy to run programs that encourage building owners to do that. And what we put in our ordinance is a requirement that when water heaters are installed, they be demand response capable. When electric water heaters are installed, they be demand response capable, so that Xcel can enroll all of the commercial and multifamily buildings in Denver and water heaters in their programs and drive demand response that way. There's a lot more than just water heaters that should be grid responsive, but we sort of left that in our ordinance to the utility and just made sure at least the water heaters have that capability, because I don't think building owners have that sophistication in most cases today.
I guess I would maybe add that demand flexibility is so important as the grid approaches this 80% renewable generation factor. Like, the degree that we can align our loads is going to increase renewable utilization on the grid, and it's going to make it cheaper for all of us. So I think it's a really important factor, and how we integrate that in a meaningful way into the BPS, I think is something I'm excited to continue exploring. And it sounds like we would, we could be cutting new territory in this realm based on what Sean and Zach said.
And I just wanted to mention, because we have a lot of land in Aurora out east, and I'm sure there are other places in Colorado that have a lot of land that's suitable for these ground mounted systems. But the substations are over capacity with other systems that are out there. So that's just one of our problems, is we could have more solar if we had upgraded substations, and that's all on our utility, and there's lots of stuff going on with that. So that was one of the problems that we're seeing in Aurora.
Any other thoughts or comments that we want to add at this point? I think what we'd like to do is we have a Miro board that if you are on a computer, you can access. If you're on a phone, you won't be able to access it, but we can continue to capture your comments in the chat. But really, we just kind of want to get sort of a sense of like where you all landing in terms of site EUI. I keep hearing that. It sounds like that's kind of the direction we're going, but what questions do we have? What concerns do we have? What needs to be resolved in order for us to be very comfortable going down that path? And then are there any comments that you want to share around the other options as well? So if that sounds okay, Diane, maybe you can kick us off. I can throw the Miro board link in the chat.
Kirk, did you have something quick?
No, it's never quick. I'll wait.
Well, if you want to put in the chat, we'll make sure we grab it. So great. So before I share my screen, I just wanted to reiterate what Julia said, that, obviously there's so many considerations, and this was a really great conversation to learn from others and hear kind of pros and cons. So now it's all of your turn to get those pros and cons on paper so that we can ensure that that these types of metrics that this group is considering for the statewide BPS is reflected both based on what you learned today, your expertise, but also your communities. Someone made a good point. John said that like Excel has great demand management incentives, but other areas do not. So thinking outside of the Front Range and some rural areas around the communities as well. So I will share my screen so you can see the Miro board for those that might not have access to it. But basically, as you're popping in there, it's the way we have it set out is just 4 sections of pros and cons and different things to consider. So what we'd love is for you all to get in there and write on those sticky notes kind of your thoughts on pros and cons based on all of the conversations that we've had today. So I see a few people in there. Julia put it in the chat. And I will share my screen. So as you can see here, we did keep, based on Kara and Katrina, thank you again, but based on their overviews of City and County of Denver and New York City, just maybe some high level pros and cons that you heard that you feel should be good to add there. This second area is really just, and it's not this versus that, but it's just kind of laying it both out there. So intensity value, absolute values, source EUI and site EUI, measuring by greenhouse gas intensity, and then the Energy Star Portfolio Manager score. And if there's something in here that you feel like you want to comment on that's not in there, I can add another box for us to dive deeper into those pieces. But essentially, we really want you all to start getting in there. And just a couple of reminders, up here is where you kind of hide the collaborators so you don't see everybody's mouses moving around. Over here is your selection tool. So it'll have to be, see how mine's a hand right now. So that's going to help me move around the board. But the mouse tool is going to be how you actually click, double click and type, and then move the cards to where you feel like they need to go.
So we'll have about 10 minutes for you to include your ideas. Just wanted to give you some time to kind of think about this. We're happy to like also be having this discussion verbally as well, but I know some people are, are like we all process things differently. We all like to communicate differently. So we wanted to give this opportunity as well for folks to share your thoughts in a different platform and method. Again, it's not a this versus that. So we're not saying like, which do you like better, Denver's approach or New York City's approach? We're just saying, what do you see as the key strongest components of these different approaches, and where there's some weaknesses that if we were to look at something as a model, where would we want to maybe make some adjustments around it? Again, if you are not able to access this on your computer screen, then feel free to throw some thoughts in the chat and I'll capture those as well.
I wonder, instead of sharing the mural board, is it possible to share any of the slides?
And the only reason we just want to ensure that the people online outside of the task force can see what's being put in the mural board. But I could,
okay. No worries.
I think actually, Diane, it'd probably be fine since I think folks understand what we're, hopefully what we're trying to get feedback on here. So if you are not able to access the mural board yourself, then are others getting an editing, a request to log in? Okay, so I apologize. I may have sent the incorrect link there.
There you go. That should be the right one.
Perfect. Thanks, Diane. Sorry, my apologies about that. And then Kirk, were there any specific slides that you think would be most helpful?
There was one of Sean's slides I felt like highlighted pros and cons related to electrification, for incentivizing electrification.
Yeah, great. Let me see. Here we go.
Diane, will you remind me how you hide all the other people's
names? I know
names?
it's tough. So on the top, you'll have a toolbar and there's like a mouse arrow with dashes next to it. It's going to be the first tool on your upper right toolbar.
Okay.
And then you just click hide collaborators. It doesn't make it very intuitive to know that you clicked it off, but
right.
Let me see if I need to do anything. Nope, I'm gonna turn it off. Did that work, Christine? Okay, great. All right, I will share my screen. And Kirk, just let me know if this was what you were looking for.
Yep, that was great. Thanks.
I wonder, could I just ask a clarifying question about the goal laid out in the state bill? Because I'd asked this offline to the state team, but I think it really affects what metric we pick, how the goal itself is defined. And I read the memo you all sent, and so let me know if we should hold on this for another time, but I can't really think through the metric until I understand the goal. And I read your memo and it doesn't align with how I just think the law itself reads. And so I really don't actually understand the goal that we're trying to reach, because the way I read the law, it says we have to reduce emissions below the 2021 emissions reported by Energy Star portfolio manager. And I think I'm not certain how we go about subtracting the grid part out of that.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Katrina. Kim, did you want to answer that, or would you like me to?
I was gonna, I look like Will unmuted, so I was gonna ask
okay
him to go for it.
I wasn't sure that I completely understood the question. So what aspect of it is it you think doesn't meet the?
So the bill says that emissions shall be reduced 7% by 2026 and 20% by 2030. The greenhouse gas emissions shall be reduced. Let me pull the language up. The greenhouse gas emissions shall be reduced as compared to 2021 levels as reported in benchmarking data. And the benchmarking data in the bill all comes in through Energy Star portfolio manager, including the emissions data. And so a 20% reduction below the 2021 benchmarking data that you're going to get in is quite large. Like right once you subtract out that you don't get to count the utility savings. And so the memo you all wrote, I'll try to summarize as it was very long on this point, said that you want to take the grid emission intensity from 2030 and assume that today, I think, and then subtract the 20% from that. But that's not what the bill says. I think I'm just not clear what the actual goal is. Or do we have to do a 20% below the 2021 levels as reported by benchmarking? Because that's a much bigger reduction than if we assume the grid has been cleaned up and then we have to do 20%. So we have to do 20% in addition to the grid cleaning based off of a 2021 baseline, which is what I think the bill says, or do we have to do 20% after the grid has been cleaned up, which is a much smaller total?
So I can speak certainly to what I think the intent of the legislation was, and the office's interpretation of that intent was that the language around not taking into account the background cleaning up of the grid was intended to require that buildings will still have to do something. It sort of gets at those graphs that we were shown earlier from some other jurisdictions where they mapped out that you wouldn't have to do anything till 2045 or 2050, that we're going to have larger than 20% reduction in emissions associated with buildings simply due to the grid cleaning up due to other requirements in statute. And so the intent was essentially to assure that there will be a 20% reduction in those things that are controlled by the buildings, which are their on-site combustion and the remaining emissions from electricity that they can address through solar or through energy efficiency on the electrical side. And we think that's the only reasonable interpretation. Otherwise, you would end up with interpretations where, for instance, if you had a building that was very heavy on electricity to start, you could end up with a requirement that would say you had to reduce your use on the on-site fossil by 100% in order to achieve that 20%. I don't think that it definitely was not the intent of the legislature, and I think it leads to, if you interpret it that way, it's an unworkable interpretation.
Yeah, I agree that it seems unworkable. It was one of my concerns at the start of this task force process, I guess. But what you're saying is that we should interpret the goal to be an energy savings goal, right? That's basically what the legislature
Well,
meant.
it's not energy savings. It's a GHG emissions goal. So for instance, electrification would contribute to GHG reductions in different ways than energy efficiency would contribute. And so, and the GHG intensity of electricity versus the GHG intensity of on-site combustion, I think we will need to take into account. But the focus is on things that are actually done at the building as opposed to those things that are happening through electric utilities making change to their generation mix.
And you're just saying we should assume a GHG intensity of 2030 for purposes of our work versus the GHG intensity of today when we determine the GHG savings of different measures. Is that right?
So the way that I would look at it is there's going to be very little change to the GHG intensity on the fuel on the on-site combustion side. So we probably need to be looking at reductions where the reduction from on-site combustion plus the reduction in emissions associated with remaining electricity emissions in 2030. That, you know, I'm not sure if I'm being clear there. But in the memo, we tried to give examples that would make that clear.
Yeah, I think the thing I'm struggling with, because we're all leaning towards this EUI target, but EUI is going to drive both electricity and gas use reductions sort of equally or similarly, but I don't know that that's the metric to hit a target if the emissions intensity of the electricity of a hit an emissions target. It's a different target than, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but the target here is different because it is an emissions target. And electricity savings have very little or much lower emissions benefit, right, by 2030. And so I don't know that an EUI target is going to actually help us reach an emissions goal because 2/3 of energy use is electricity. And what's going to be left in 2030 in terms of emissions is all of the natural gas. And so anyway, I'm struggling a bit with an emissions goal and I think we need to have a little bit more information to be able to pick the right metric. Because while I like the EUI metric, and I think it's simple, it is not going to drive a particularly strong reduction in gas versus electricity.
Yeah, I agree with you that I think we probably need more discussion on this. And that's part of the reason why I was interested in the question whether we could get data separately on the EUI associated with on-site combustion and with electricity.
Right.
So being mindful of everyone's time here, we want to wrap it up in the next minute or so. So I just wanted to talk about our next steps. We can definitely dive into these questions more in the next meeting and in subsequent conversations. I think this is really important for us to kind of figure out the make sure we're all understanding the same approach and that is informing the metric that we decide on in a way that makes a lot of sense. So what we're going to do between now and the next meeting is first and foremost, we're going to leave this Miro board open until, Dan, why don't we do it until about noon tomorrow? And then folks can keep adding your thoughts and ideas to that. Following that, we will post the tonight we'll post, or today rather, keep thinking it's later in the day, but we'll post the presentation from IMT and NBI onto monday.com. And if you have additional questions, then please add those in there. We'll send a first round of any questions that we've received to Zach and Sean by like Wednesday of next week, and look for them to hopefully get us answers by Friday of the following week, knowing that we've got a holiday and everything. And then if there's additional questions, then we will gather those as well. Likewise, we'll post the minutes from today's meeting up on monday.com too. We've been taking a lot of notes on everything that you guys have been saying verbally as well as in the chat. So as you go through those, if you wouldn't mind, please reading through those notes and letting us know kind of what your thoughts are, any additional questions, and kind of what areas we really want to dig into more in the future meetings. We do have a couple of other items of pre-work before the next meeting, so we'll post up a power of information presentation from the EPA did that provides some great information. I'm sure we'll have some additional resources as well. And then we're also going to start preparing a working document that starts to guide us in our subsequent conversations, that basically says what we're hearing so far is, we want to go with site EUI, or what we're hearing so far is, that we need to consider performance-based and prescriptive, or, we'll just start to be able to narrow it down by using this guiding document. So that'll be shared as a Google Doc. In order to comply with the Open Records Act, it won't be something that you all are able to comment on in the doc itself, but we encourage you to send us your comments and we will make sure that they get added in. Just want to be mindful of not having those conversations between you all, but we still want to gather your feedback. So, so share all of your thoughts on that, and then we can loop back to them and discuss them at the next meeting. At our next meeting, I want to start off with those guiding goals. We had to walk away from those today because we wanted to be able to get to Zach and Sean's presentation, but we'll start off with those. So we'll add those up into monday.com again, and with some revisions to the workforce ones that we talked about today. So again, please throw in there any comments that you have that, or send to us directly any comments that you have on changes that you might suggest making to those guiding goals. And we'll start next week's or next month's conversation rather, with confirming those final guiding goals. And then we'll move into kind of holding, this won't be our final vote, but an initial vote on metrics. So I know we need more information, but want to start seeing like where are we landing in terms of which metric we want to use. And then we'll have a presentation from Overlay and Iconergy to discuss the baseline conditions, the covered building lists for Colorado, and all of the benchmarking data that has been received so far. So Iconergy has a wealth of data that they're sorting through. So they'll be able to share with you a lot of information that will hopefully start to answer some of these questions that we have. And then we'll start to get into discussions around compliance pathways as well. So thank you all so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate it. This was a great conversation. I think we're all like learning a lot. There's a lot more to be discussed, but I'm really excited about the pathway that we're taking forward. So thank you all. And we'll stick around for a few minutes if you have any questions or concerns.